Hello and welcome to this video on the two primary options for storing your home brew, bottling and kegging. Kegging is storing your brew in a large metal cylinder. It is the modern equivalent of barrels. Bottling is relatively self-explanatory. You pour your home brew into a generally glass bottle. The bottles are nearly always much smaller than a keg. While both allow for carbonation, they use very different methods. In many respects, each has its own application and use, but some may need to choose one option or the other. Most home brewers will learn how to bottle their beer very soon after anything else. It's very difficult to store the large quantities required that some people will start with. Others may begin with smaller volumes and build up over time. Despite this, they will still need to transfer their brew into smaller vessels so they can use their fermenting equipment for the next run. The reality is that over time, you will gradually gravitate towards kegs, especially with beer. The simple reality is a keg being much larger means you can fit more of your brew into one container, rather than having to divide it up into many smaller containers. If you regularly entertain or share at your own residence, a keg is a great way to do this due to that scale. Bottling can also have some of its own benefits by contrast to this. The question has always been how to balance which option to go with and whether or not you would choose one over the other. This is something of a chicken or egg argument. Kegs do have some certain advantages, and there's no real argument about these advantages, they are simply a fact. You don't need to worry to anywhere near the same extent with regards to sanitizing and capping. A keg is just the equivalent of one large bottle. Everything goes in it, but it means you only need to sanitize and seal once. On top of this, the very design of a keg means that you can carbonate it much more easily. In fact, carbonation can take as little as 2 days versus a week or several weeks, depending on the amount of residual yeast. There's also a question about how impressive a keg is, and this will vary based on age and to a certain extent personal opinion. Having a large keg can look somewhat impressive, all the more so at a party if you're in your early 20s and at university. There are also some home setups where a keg adds to the ambience. There's also a question about your environmental impact. Just how much is one keg worth when compared to several cases of beer bottles? One keg can be dozens, if not several dozens, of boxes worth of beer bottles. This means that one keg can be dealt with and have the same impact on the environment as these dozens and dozens of other bottles. Admittedly, these are the upsides to a keg, and with every upside, there will always be downsides as well. We've mentioned that a keg is the equivalent of several bottles, in fact, dozens of bottles. This also means they take up the same amount of space in terms of the volume of beer they hold, cider, or for that matter anything else you put in there. A keg is a very large object. It is quite heavy and can be cumbersome to move. If you are in a much smaller residence or location where you're brewing, a keg may not be viable. Where you could store a dozen or several dozen bottles in a cupboard, a keg due to that size may not fit. There is also the simple reality that a keg is very expensive. Even if you aren't going to go top of the line, with a cheaper option, you are still going to pay considerably more for a keg versus bottles. This is further compounded by some of the peripheral equipment and gadgets required for a keg to be used. These can be things like keeping it cold, the appropriate dispensing equipment, and so on. Each of these is a consideration on top of the keg price itself. Bottling now has its opportunity to shine. Bottles will take up considerably less space than kegs, and for many people, they will come in a box that's already set up to organize them for you and keep them safely packaged. If that isn't an option, and you don't wish to store them that way, there are other ways to do it. The simplest option is to simply leave them on the bottle tree drying rack when they're not in use. If that is a concern, depending on what sort of method you've used to seal the bottles, you may be able to simply lay them on a side in a cupboard and stack them high. This means they're out of the way, even if they are more difficult to access. Sharing is another factor. It's not hard to give a friend or someone you're trying to get on the good side of several bottles of your finest home brew and let them take it away. Giving them an entire keg, not so straightforward. There's also pricing. Bottles are going to cost you significantly less. This is among a number of reasons, one of which is transport of a large keg due to its weight and size is far more expensive. The materials made for the keg are more expensive. They're produced fewer at a time, and due to simple economics, the glass bottle is a favourite and far cheaper. In a pinch, and if you're so inclined, you can even reuse commercial beer bottles, although we do discourage this for a number of reasons. There's also some aspects to beer in a bottle that simply can't be made possible with a keg. One of these is flavour. Beer stored in a keg and carbonated in a keg versus being in a bottle is much different than what beer will come out of said bottle. The way the keg works does change its flavour, and the reality is the additional yeast in suspension when drunk from a bottle has changed what's going on. The process of carbonating in a bottle also adds different flavours. There's also the reality that, unlike with a keg, which is very large and very obvious, a small surplus of bottles of beer, cider, or whatever else can be put out of way and out of mind and left to age. The reality is that unless you have a ridiculous surplus of kegs, it's unlikely you're going to forget that one of these is occupied. There are, of course, as said, always downsides to something that must have an upside. With bottling, this comes down to, in part, time. You need to wait at least 2 weeks for your beer or similar beverage to carbonate. This is the time it takes for the sugar to be converted into carbon dioxide. That process, and for that matter many of the other processes that occur with the bottled beer or similar, can be somewhat inconsistent. This is because each bottle is its own thing, and while you would hope to have some consistency, there will unavoidably be variation. This variation could be something as insignificant as the sediment you observe on the bottom of the bottle. Some bottles may have a much thicker layer than others. While this is generally a harmless addition, it does become somewhat off-putting to people who aren't familiar with it. Finally, there is the comparison between one giant bottle in the form of a keg, which can hold many dozen equivalents of smaller bottles, versus the process of cleaning, sanitizing, drying, filling, and then sealing those same equivalent dozens of bottles individually. You then need to ensure that whatever you have gone and bottled can be identified and tracked backwards. In case something goes wrong, you find an exceptionally good batch that for some reason, through some minor tweak in the recipe, has turned out far better than you'd planned, versus being able to find a single large keg which has been consistent right throughout. As you can see, there are some very strong arguments for both options. This is not a one is definitively better than the other. It is largely impossible for one option to be a solution for every situation. While some people will favour one solution over another for various reasons, such as their location, the facilities available, or their preference for something like, say, consistency, there is always a reason to consider both options. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.